When a court determines that community treatment can't meet the special needs of a delinquent youth, a judge may refer the juvenile to a secured treatment program. Correctional institutions are operated by federal, state, and county governments, as well as private institutions. They can be identified as secure, meaning that residents' movements are restricted, or they can be open, where movement is less restricted and the offender is given more freedom. Let's step back and look at the history of our juvenile institutions. The progressive era in the U.S. Was a time of extensive social reform. The period, which formally spanned between 1900 and 1918, was preceded by nearly a century of discontent. During the progressive era, Americans saw the growth of the women's suffrage movement, the campaign against child labor, the fight for the 8-hour workday, and the uses of journalism and cartooning to expose quote-unquote big business corruption. Prior to the progressive era, child offenders over the age of 7 were imprisoned, just like adults. Such had been the model historically, but the actions of political and social reformers, as well as the research of psychologists in the 18th and 19th centuries, began to shift in society's views on juvenile delinquents. Early reformers who were interested in rehabilitating rather than punishing children built the New York House of Refuge in 1824. The reformatory housed juveniles who earlier would have been placed in adult jails. Beginning in 1899, individual states took note of the problem of youth incarceration and began establishing a similar youth reform homes. These institutions provided educational and psychological services to improve the conduct of juveniles who are forcibly detained. In the second half of the 19th century, we have the cottage systems. They were developed. Juvenile offenders were housed in a series of small cabins, each one holding about 20 to 40 children, and they were run by quote-unquote cottage parents who attempted to create home-like atmosphere. And the first cottage system was in 1855 in Massachusetts. 20th century had some developments. Let's kind of run through our eras here. 1899, the first juvenile court. That was in Illinois, remember from chapter 1. But it also came to expand the use of confinement in that time. In the 1930s, we saw the Civilian Conservation Corps, which began to emerge, which required juveniles to work as a means of rehabilitation and earn money. They had to earn enough to return home. Also at this time, the U.S. Children's Bureau sought to reform juvenile institutions. Again, we kind of covered that a little bit in chapter 1. In the 1940s, the American Law Institute's Model Youth Correctional Authority Act was passed, and it's often cited as a turning point in American juvenile correctional history. It was radically breaking the traditional thinking and practice in juvenile corrections. It proposed a model of juvenile justice based on rehabilitation instead of punishment. And it called for state-level coordination of these services. The 1960s brought us a slew of Supreme Court cases involving juvenile rights. We kind of covered those, but In re Galt was our main one, the child who was incarcerated for 15 years for making an obscene phone call. That started a series of Supreme Court cases involving juvenile rights. The 1970s, the focus was on least restrictive alternatives, looking for the removal of status offenders, those who break curfew or run away, skip school, from secured confinement, and also mixing juveniles and adults in jails. In the 80s and the 90s, that saw a substantial increase in admissions to juvenile correctional facilities. This is also a time when the crime rate was on the rise, which peaked in 1996. Training schools became overcrowded. The cost of confinement grew. In 1994, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention was established, and it reported on the widespread problems in juvenile justice facilities, such as overcrowding, inadequate health care, lack of security, poor monitoring of suicidal behavior. Today, juvenile institutions are both public and private, but most delinquent juveniles are housed in public facilities. Private institutions are relatively small with a specific mission, i.e. they're treating females or in some fashion, maybe it's with emotional problems. The trends, the most delinquents, like I said, are housed in public facilities. Most of the status offenders are held in private facilities, even though the federal government has pointed out that these status offenders should not be incarcerated or should be dealt with in a different way, but it's still happening. Juveniles held in custody reached its peak in 2000, and it has decreased by 50% through 2013. How these places look, physical plans and living areas, they vary in size from institution to institution and, of course, in quality. But they are different from adult prisons. There's more emphasis on treatment and less on punishment. Among juvenile facilities, some are small in housing, about 10 to 20. Others have several hundred juveniles. Some have moderate freedom where they can go into the community, attend school, and others have a more adult-like prison approach, meaning they're surrounded by fencing and they have secured cells and the juveniles are closely monitored. So who is a typical resident in a juvenile facility? 15 to 16 years old in age, primarily male. Crimes mostly incarcerated for are serious crimes, murder, rape, assault, but there are some property crimes and drug offenders as well. Like I said, while federal guidelines strongly urge against confinement on status crimes, those who commit them are nevertheless punished or confined. Not surprisingly, based on what we've learned already, the minority youth are more likely to be incarcerated as punishment for their offenses. 7 in 10 juveniles in custody belong to a racial or ethnic minority group. As indicated, males make up the bulk of the youths incarcerated. 7 out of every 8 incarcerated juvenile is male. Males are much more likely than females to be confined for serious violent crimes. Girls are more likely to be confined for status offenses. Females are also more likely to be incarcerated as a result of violating probation. Females have a much different experience incarcerated than males. While the number of incarcerated females is less than males, that number is increasing faster than males, increasing at a rate of 57%. The double standard that we discussed in the gender and delinquency chapter continues as the female offender is held in custody. Institutions for girls are more restricted than those for boys and do less than adequate job of rehabilitation. Even though it's shown that females suffer from similar issues as males, not much is happening for them as for the males. Programming tends to reinforce those traditional roles for women. Over the years, the number of females held in public institution has declined, but like I said, girls tend to be incarcerated longer. We talked about that in the gender and delinquency chapter. Female offenders have higher rates of mental health problems and are typically isolated in rural areas or suffer emotional or Yes, or they suffer emotional and or sexual abuse from correctional workers. That's a problem. Let's talk about treatment. Most institutions employ some form of treatment program. The fundamental purpose of correction treatment is to change the behavior of the youth so that they do not commit future delinquent acts. While the goal itself sounds nice and simple, accomplishing that goal is anything but easy. There are two types. We have individual treatment techniques, and there are group treatment techniques. Regarding individual, all institutions provide individual counseling. The most successful programs provide training to improve interpersonal and behavioral skills. Counseling does not attempt to change a youth's personality, but rather assist them in understanding and solving their current adjustment problems. That is the focus. Individual treatment programs are built around psychotherapy. By analyzing the individual's childhood experiences, a therapist helps a juvenile solve conflicts and make a more positive adjustment to society. Reality therapy, that's another form of individual counseling. It emphasizes on the juvenile's current behavior and requires the individual to accept responsibility for all of his or her actions. And then there's behavior modification, our social learning theory in play here. All behavior is learned, and that current behavior can be shaped through rewards and punishments. Group treatment techniques. In group treatment, which is counseling that occurs among several individuals in a group setting, it's more economical than individual treatment, but also having group support is often valuable to the juveniles or individuals in general. And there's three primary types in the facilities. There's guided group interaction, positive peer culture, and millennial therapy. Milieu therapy, this is where the environment is manipulated to benefit the juvenile. They may, for example, living within a community where life is structured. That's an example. Just to step back, the positive peer culture focuses on improving social skills and cultivating strength in youth by developing a youth's care and concern for others in a group setting. And the guided group interaction, it's a group treatment that focuses on a particular type of problem, whether it be a social problem or an educational problem. And as the group forms, usually 10 or so individuals, a group leader will emerge on topics and such. This is just the general approach that we're talking about here, so you have an idea of types of group treatment techniques. Let's skip on forward to educational, vocational, recreational programs. There are a number of programs that are in juvenile correctional facilities. One of the most important ones is education. One of the primary goals of juvenile institutional corrections is education. While the education level of the juveniles in secured facilities varies dramatically, most are well below where they should be in their educational achievement. Juveniles, that is. In addition to overcoming past educational deficiencies, educators in correctional facilities must deal with youths who are not model students in academic study skills or classroom behavior. Educational programs in juvenile facilities often serve as the core program, consuming the largest portion of a juvenile's time. Educators in these facilities often feel isolated, alienated, and ill-prepared to teach incarcerated juvenile offenders. Research indicates that educators are indeed seldom prepared for the juvenile confinement setting, where students are rarely uniform in age, grade level, academic competency, or behavior. Youths in institutional settings manifest many problems beyond educational problems, and this often includes violent acting out. Teachers in these settings also are expected to work with other counselors and security staff to integrate aspects of treatment plans and institutional discipline into the classroom. Teachers in correctional institutions must incorporate innovative teaching methods to stimulate incarcerated youths to learn. The environment of the school and the attitude of the educators are directly related to the effectiveness of the school itself. Research on correctional education has revealed that education is regarded by facility administrators as the most important component of the rehabilitation process. Another program in juvenile corrections is vocational programs. The majority of delinquents age 16 years and older do not return to school after release from a correctional setting. While correctional educators must find better ways to motivate students to return to school, they must also provide students with the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed in entry-level jobs. Juveniles who will enter the workplace need training in working productively with others on teams, acquiring and using information, understanding and utilizing systems, and using technology. To this end, many facilities develop relationships with business partners in a kind of like a symbolic fashion to train juveniles for work in the real world. Some facilities develop internships, apprenticeships, and mentorships with business partners. The types of examples range from, auto repair to computer training. However, back to the double standard, the females tend to be in female traditional roles, or i.e. sex typing. So educational programs, vocational programs are I'd say available, but they have to be in juvenile institutions. We'll talk more about that, why they have to be in our next segment. But let's talk about some other programs that exist. I'm going to come back to the wilderness programs because I want to talk about this juvenile boot camps. Very important concept. The correctional sanction that has undoubtedly generated the greatest amount of controversy in the recent years is juvenile boot camps. A boot camp is a secured correctional facility that emphasizes military-style discipline, physical training, and an extremely regimented schedule. The name boot camp is derived from the military, and the program follows a military regimen and training style. The first correctional boot camps began in Georgia and Oklahoma, 1983, and by the end of the 1990s, there were about 75 boot camps operating nationally in over 30 states. The concept started with adult prisoners, but was soon implemented at the juvenile level. Boot camps were extraordinarily popular during an era when the public and politicians saw them as a way of getting tough on juvenile crime. But there was incidences like a 2006 death of a teen in a Florida boot camp that kind of slowed the demand for the program. 14-year-old Martin Lee Anderson died after attending a juvenile boot camp in Bay County, Florida. Sheriff's office officials were seen on a widely distributed videotape beating and kicking the teen after he collapsed during a mandatory 1-mile run. So that kind of was a turning point for juvenile boot camps. The evaluations of boot camps provided mixed findings of their usefulness as a correctional alternative. Additional criticism has been levied at the concept of boot camps themselves. One commentator concluded that the nature of boot camps does not fit well with the basic principles of adolescent development. Boot camps do not allow the juveniles to have a voice in their treatment, and they tend to be very negative, especially at the outset. In a broader sense, boot camps violate a primary principle of the juvenile justice system, which is individualized treatment. Boot camps that have been founded more recently have taken a more holistic philosophy that includes a range of programming and aftercare services. In addition, the offenders who are selected for boot camp are screened more carefully than they were when the facilities first came into operation. Lastly, future evaluations are going to determine if the boot camp is a viable alternative sanction that reduces the idea that juveniles are reoffending reduces reoffending, and whether or not it actually costs less than traditional secured facilities. We don't have any research on that. Until it is compiled, boot camps are going to remain controversial, and they have, at the adult level, they have closed. So many of them in New York State have closed. We only have 3 left in the state, and it's highly questionable whether they're successful at the adult level too. So wilderness programs, another program. They've become very popular for juveniles, especially in the late 1970s and early 1980s. These types of programs emphasize physical challenges, survival skills, and mental challenges through outdoor adventures and nature trips. One of the most popular of these programs that serves delinquents as well as non-delinquents is Outward Bound. A variety of these types of programs are still flourishing today. There actually was one here in the Adirondacks for a number of years. They have since closed up. But the focus is on learning how to survive in the wilderness while also developing life skills. Some programs are lengthy, while others may be, for a weekend or a week or two. So that sums up the secured corrections, juvenile corrections. The question we're going to answer and discuss in the next video is, does a juvenile offender delinquent have a legal right to treatment while they are in secured confinement, i.e., must they be provided with treatment?